Recording in progress.
All right, well, wonderful. We're here for lesson 3. So last week we covered the virtue of making sure we're at full screen here. Yeah, I think we are. Yep.
They don't know.
Oh, it's like
Now you're
slide recording.
forced to share a little.
Oh, yes. Okay. So brief announcement at the very beginning that my former girlfriend Rhiannon is now my fiance. So yeah, so just got
She's lovely. Congratulations.
Absolutely. I'm very, very lucky. So
No,
yes.
you're blessed.
You're right. Yes, that's the proper word for it. Quite blessed. Quite blessed.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay,
so-
you go now. You can feel lucky.
There we go. Yeah. Yes. I feel every which kind of word: joyful, lucky, blessed, blissful, everything. So now, last week then we covered the first cardinal virtue of prudence. And before we jump in for this week, maybe just if there's any reflections or thoughts that anybody had, or any kind of carryovers about prudence that you'd want to mention here before we dive into our second cardinal virtue of justice.
I have a question. I have an
Yes.
idea of what prudence is, but what is your definition?
So prudence is, we looked last week that prudence has the same root in terms of just the root of the word as providence. So in a way, God's providential oversight of creation in the world is mirrored in some smaller form through our own exercise of prudence. So providence meaning literally to see ahead, and prudence can be thought of as practical wisdom.
Okay.
Practical wisdom. So when you talk about something being second nature, or when you talk about an athlete that has muscle memory or something like that, that's really getting more toward the heart of what prudence is, like applied wisdom versus just an abstract kind of knowing in the abstract. It's knowledge that's rooted to the concrete realities of the world. And of course, like we saw on the first lesson, it's a virtue that, like all the others, is attained by habit, by repetition, and becomes ingrained in you in that way. So it's the mother of prudence, is the mother of all virtues, because all other virtues imply it or require it in some sense. In order to exercise, we talked about kind of the components of prudence as open-mindedness, as objectivity, and kind of a certain nimbleness too. We talked about, because it's again as applied to concrete circumstances. So you might know in the abstract what to do in a certain situation, but then life throws you a curveball, and so being able to react on the fly, given what reality is like, is part of prudence. So again, very practically kind of grounded. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of recap some of that again, because all the other virtues imply prudence in some degree or another. And that includes our topic for today, which is the second cardinal virtue of justice. And this ordering too is not arbitrary by any means. Next to prudence, justice would rank very highly among the cardinal virtues, and we'll begin to see something why in just a moment. But before we begin, I think it'd be good to open up in prayer to ask for God's gift of his discernment and clarity, and the ability to come to some deeper understanding in today's lesson. So please join me as we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who have trespassed against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, so I begin here with a few, yes. Steam. Away with you. There we go. So begin just with kind of a quote that even, again, the cardinal virtues are interesting because they are virtues that are recognized that in principle anyone can attain. It's not something that's the exclusive domain or property of those who are renewed in a life of faith, that these are things that classically have been acknowledged that reason and those who are engaged in life that's committed to the good life can attain to. So that goes for, again, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So justice is something that, classically speaking, you wouldn't simply say that only a Christian or only someone who knows God is capable of exercising. And so we begin with a quote from Aristotle, who waxes kind of poetic about justice, saying, "The evening star nor the morning star is as glorious as justice." And he's not just paying a certain kind of lip service, as we'll see in a moment. Part of the reason why I titled this Justice the Outward Virtue is very much associated with that kind of understanding of justice as something that shines or radiates or is glorified. Whereas prudence is very much internal and deals with the internal structure for how we form our actions, what's going on behind the scenes, how we observe and appropriate reality and then form our thought. I mean, last week we talked about deliberation, judgment, and decision, all these mental processes that go on behind the scenes. Justice, by contrast, is much more objective or accessible and discernible by third parties. You know, I can't look at Becky and say, just by looking at you, whether or not you're being prudent, but I can certainly much more easily judge whether or not your acts are, the act that you're engaged in is just or not. And so we'll get into that in just a moment. Now, to begin with, and again, the approach we've kind of been taking for these classes, because we just have an hour for each of these virtues, is less to make an argument and a case for why the definition is the way it is, but it's more so to begin with the definition and take it as received wisdom from the Christian tradition, which it is, and then sort of unpack it. And so it's almost the kind of, not a deductive approach, but kind of an inductive approach, is looking at the definition and then seeing why its parts are the way they are. So last week we looked at a little image or a statue of prudence, and one of the, does anyone remember what some of the symbols that prudence had associated with it? The visual, Peter?
The mirror and the snake.
The mirror and the snake. And why would that be?
Well, to me, the mirror is like self-reflection, and the snake is like temptation and evil. And
So maybe that kind of learning how to navigate around those sort of pitfalls and things like that, and certainly the mirror, because she's staring at herself in the mirror, so that ability to self-reflect. So what is justice in this case pictured with?
Scales. Yeah.
Scales, yes.
And a sword to wield.
And a sword, yeah. Scales and a sword. And what else is a very notable aspect of that depiction?
Balance.
The blindfold? Yes.
Yeah.
So why, okay, so the scales might be fairly straightforward, but it bears stating, I think, why the scales?
Balance equal.
Okay, equality. And a true weight, a true weighing of things, and making sure that things even out, fairness. Why then the sword? Absolutely, I think absolutely. That it belongs to the domain of justice to enforce, yes, execute just authority. So there's a certain level of authority and power of enforcement that is associated with the virtue of justice when properly exercised. And then the blindfold.
For everybody.
Is justice handicapped?
Yeah. There's no bias.
Right. Okay. So no respecter of persons, and that's certainly a biblical principle. You can look to when Paul says, don't, if you are thinking of people in the congregation and you see that someone's really wealthy and really well-to-do and they're adorned very affluently, or let's say some movie star comes into our church, if you give them the position of preeminence and you say, oh yeah, you sit here in the front and you give them special service and treatment, then Paul comes down very hard on that and says, in that sense, you're being a respecter of persons, and especially to the extent that you ignore those who are less favorably adorned, or maybe, someone who's obviously homeless or something like that, that is a severe violation of the Christian principle. So yes, so several classic symbols for justice, that power, that authority, that balance, that fairness, things being equaled out, and also that impartiality that goes on, which also kind of has to do with that objectivity too, that justice is sort of in the public domain, so to speak. So we'll begin with foundations. This little bubble says foundations. So we'll just begin with sort of a summary, basic definition, and then work our way and kind of break it down from there. So you have this on your notes as well, that justice is a habit. So again, like all the other virtues, a habit acquired through repetition, whereby a man renders to each one his due with constant and perpetual will. So any initial thoughts, and again, it's a very summary, general definition, but any thoughts about that preliminary definition? Justice is a habit whereby a man renders to each one his due with constant and perpetual will. I mean, could be questions, or yes, I agree, no, I don't agree. Peter.
To me, it's not a satisfactory definition.
Mm-hmm.
There are many, many huge flaws in it, in my judgment. For example, to each man one his due. According to who? According to what?
Right. So that's the first thing that would occur to me on reading this without any other context is, okay, well, maybe it's not contradictory, but it's maybe so low resolution that it's not very useful. And I would certainly agree there. It sort of invites the question, okay, well, what's someone's due? Absolutely, yeah, and that I didn't mean to cut you off, but I would agree with you there.
You didn't cut me off, but that to me is the number one flaw, and it is huge.
Now that I agree 100% that and that's why perhaps the beginning section, as we begin to unpack this definition, again, this definition is the product of a series of arguments and observations and concepts, and so what's embedded into this understanding is quite rich. So if you take it on face value, you're left with something very impoverished. But if you can sort of, as it were, backload into it, which is what we'll hope to do in a general way throughout the rest of the presentation, the right kind of conceptual understanding, then perhaps we can get somewhere that's more useful. So 100%. As it stands, it really invites the question of, okay, to make this useful or helpful, we need to at least know something along the lines of how does something come to be one's due, and what is one's due? Any other observations about it, the definition before we begin? Claudia, was it you?
In a positive way, each one of us would be responsible to treat each person equally. As you were saying in the beginning, what the picture evoked was, I wouldn't pick and choose my standard for when I thought possibly had a lower status, a higher status, whatever. This would be equal, or I would treat each one as importantly as the
Right, so it doesn't say, right, so to each one, you're emphasizing the each one, where it's,
one.
yeah, justice is not only applicable to some subset that is to your preference or a certain group of people. So there's that universality that's implied in that.
So a higher standard.
Right.
Calls me to a higher standard.
And constant and perpetual will perhaps suggests a distinction between maybe cunning and tactfulness and deception and true justice, whereas true justice is enduring, that constant and perpetual will. In other words, if you give someone their due, their just deserts, so to speak, but then you renege on it, or you change your mind, there's kind of a duplicity there, that would also fall short of justice. So justice has to endure in that verdict, so to speak. Yes.
As a sweeping generalization, I have a firm opinion which I think can be easily defended.
Okay.
Regarding the due if you look at the penal codes of California, the US federal code, of any state, as a generalization, every crime in one form or another is a violation of one or more of the 10 commandments.
Hmm.
And in that sense, I think a compelling argument can be made that there's something in the human nature that just, if you're raised, and this is important, if you're raised in Western civilization,
Right.
if you have that Western civilization imprint on your psyche, most people who are reasonably constituted at some level will reason from and to the 10 commandments as that's what you're due. You violated this, so you should get this.
Right. I think there's some very deep wisdom in that, and the tradition would say some very interesting things about the 10 Commandments, about how the 10 Commandments is less a unique revelation of the Christian tradition and more a Judeo-Christian codification and elevation of what would be called the natural law, which is sort of what Paul emphasizes in Romans 1, you know, that it's sort of the power of God, the majesty of God, the reality of God is observable through creation, is that these basic principles are, you know, they're obvious enough to be able to convict you of the fact that you ought to have known better. You know, you can't just say, I don't think that murdering someone in cold blood was a wrong thing. You know, there's something more deeply embedded, and that's codified and elevated in the 10 Commandments. It's a funny thing about law, just, and then we'll advance forward here. There's a funny joke that in a history of Christianity class where the Roman law, which was very highly developed, and with the fall of the Roman Empire, of quite a bit of civilization was lost or at least scattered, and that, you know, you had the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. What a lot of the societies were using in the dark, or I don't like that term, the Middle Ages, was the Lex Lombarda, the law of the Lombards. It was part of the Roman law that was recovered. And then as this happens with monasteries in the Middle Ages, is that someone knocked over a bookshelf and discovered these manuscripts that had been lost for centuries of the actual old Roman law. And it was so much more robust and so much more rich than the sort of truncated Lex Lombarda that they, you know, essentially replaced it, and it took the status, and they nicknamed the Lex Lombarda the Fex Lombarda. And fex is the singular of the plural word feces. So, so yeah, just a funny little thing is that, yeah, when it comes to legal code, so much has been put into it through the centuries, and in that case, they were able to see that drastic difference side by side. Now, I want us to begin with an example, as we've done in the previous lesson. We watched a video clip from Les Miserables and kind of used that as sort of in the back of our minds to be thinking of as we were looking through the rest of the lesson. In this case, I'm just going to read to you a short little snippet here. And rather than, again, just like before, trying to answer it in the moment, I just want it to kind of sit in the back of our minds and have it be informed by and maybe be a grounding kind of point for these various topics we're going to hit on about rights, the other, and so on. So I'm going to want you to keep in your mind whether you would naturally side more with A or with B in this example. This is again from Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. All right. A, who may own a store or be a police officer or a construction worker, has struggled to save enough from his earnings to buy a small house, to send his children to local college, to pay for some special type of medical care for his parents. He now finds all of his projects threatened by rising taxes. He regards this threat to his projects as unjust. He claims to have a right to what he has earned and that nobody else has a right to take away what he acquired legitimately and to which he has a just title. He intends to vote for candidates and for political office who will defend his property, his projects, and his conception of justice. We have A. B, who may be a member of one of the liberal professions or a social worker or someone with inherited wealth, is impressed with the arbitrariness of the inequalities in the distribution of wealth, income, and opportunity. He is, if anything, even more impressed with the inability of the poor and the deprived to do very much about their own condition as a result of inequalities in the distribution of power. He regards both these types of inequality as unjust and as constantly engendering further injustice. He believes more generally that all inequality stands in need of justification, and that the only possible justification for inequality is to improve the condition of the poor and the deprived by, for example, fostering economic growth. He draws the conclusion that in present circumstances, redistributive taxation which will finance welfare and the social services is what justice demands. He intends to vote for candidates for political office who will defend redistributive taxation and his conception of justice. So,
Like today.
yes, it's a little bit like today. I want us to think, because as I read both of those, I can guarantee you, almost without exception, but very few exceptions, when I read those, you in the inner voice of your mind, sided probably fairly strongly with one side or the other. And maybe you could grant some concessions to the other side, but your understanding of justice likely would align with one side or the other. On the one side, you have this understanding of just entitlement, kind of a doctrine of rights and private property and so on. And then you have this other understanding that's based a little bit more on claims of need and of the common welfare and the social good and things like that. So part of why I read this is to highlight part of that dilemma that harkens back to our first introductory lesson. And that's that we are very quickly have already and are continuing to lose the kind of language with which we can engage in a common dialogue with each other about these kinds of things. Part of what I want to highlight is that A and B are very often at an impasse, and their own logic will be consistent within their own sphere of reference and with whatever principles they've embedded into their argument. But to what extent are they able actually to cross over and have a conversation that's based on common principles? There is no answer, but without saying too much, I would say that my opinion is that common ground is very, very, very thin ground with which to dialogue. And so you essentially have echo chambers. And so with that, hopefully we can touch on a few of these topics that are kind of embedded into that definition that we're looking at, that maybe will begin to furnish us and equip us with something that's prior to this massive split that we've seen. And the political differences in our society are just one symptom of a deeper split that's already gone on in our culture long ago. So that's sort of the hope. So keep that in the back of your mind. And maybe the question is not just which side do I side with more strongly, but how would I go about getting A and B to agree on something, or at least participate in a conversation that wasn't just shooting past each other or two people in an echo chamber right next to each other. So towards what you were saying, Peter, beginning with rights, there's sort of, to make this definition useful at all or intelligible at all or anything along those lines, we have to have some sense of rights. We have to have some sense of, well, what is my due and how do I come to be due anything? So just by way of a little bit of a summary, and you have this on your notes here, which are a little bit more spelled out than last week's notes, but as a matter of logic, rights are prior to justice. You can only make justice dealing with what is owed and that restoration of balance, like we saw with the scales. It presupposes that there is some kind of debt. And then that debt needs to be justified. And what is the foundation for saying that anybody can owe anybody anything else? So rights become kind of central to that conversation. We cannot render to each other what is due unless there is a debt owed, and there can be nothing due no debt, unless there's a ground to claim that obligation. So this is where, and I just had quotes from a few different thinkers. Thomas Aquinas is in here. And again, less trying to deduce these quotes than just to look at them and kind of try and unpack them. Aquinas says something really fascinating that might sound like a truism at first. He says that it is through creation that the created being first comes to have his rights. Now, obviously, that sounds kind of like a truism to an extent, right? You can't have anything until you exist. So before you exist, there's no you to have it. But there's a really interesting implication that when I first looked at this, I overlooked. And that implication is, so it is through creation that the created being first comes to have his rights. Therefore, creation itself is not an act of justice, because creation is not anyone's due. If justice is sort of responding to the reality of a debt owed on the basis and foundation of rights, and you don't have rights, a created being can't come to have those until it is created, then the act of creation itself is not a matter of justice. It's not something that we're owed. And there's a beautiful point in that that's wholly in keeping with the Christian tradition. And that's essentially that creation itself is an act of love. Creation is not an act of a cosmic mechanism playing out kind of a tit for tat. It's not just an absolute necessity of the divine nature that had to spell this out, or that God had to create us in order so that he could have something to love, or anything along those lines. So creation itself is gratuitous, and all of our existence is kind of on that fundamental foundation. So within this conversation of justice, it's important to keep in mind that we're always separating out each of these topics in these lessons, but everything is always interwoven, and justice is never just considered in its own respect. So it's important to keep in mind that all of this around us, the fact that we're here at all, is on the basis of love, not on the basis of a debt or an obligation that God had. Is really a free thing, a free choice in that sense from God. Now, as you see in the notes here, I say that God owes us no debt, which is fitting, right? If God is God and God's self-sufficient and omnipotent and eternal, it would be odd to think that he owed it to us to create us or something along those lines. Which is not to say that he doesn't shower us with goodness and grace, but it's just a matter of saying that God's not our servant. And this is another quote from a different scholastic from the Middle Ages, where he put it this way, that God's debt is to himself. He renders to himself what is due to himself. So God satisfies within his own context the necessity of his own nature. But again, that's fully in keeping with God's own self-sufficiency. In fact, when I was studying in Oxford, we did a little bit of apologetics with Islamic friends and those kind of audiences. And one of the apologetics that I liked was that the Muslim conception of Allah is, when we have these debates, we often say Trinity versus Tawhid. And Tawhid is that word for oneness. And so, they believe that Christians believe in three gods, and they say God is only one. And kind of a counter to that sparks interesting conversation is to say, okay, well, if Allah is completely self-sufficient and all-powerful, just like we would say the Christian understanding of God, and he's needs nothing, then what, in order for him truly to exercise love of another, how or what was he loving before the creation? And so in other words, if there's not three persons, if there's not a real genuine community within the Godhead himself, Allah was loving himself. But that's not really this I-thou kind of relationship with an other in a real meaningful sense of the word. So there's this understanding, hello, Mom. And there's this understanding that that would imply that Allah is insufficient, that he required creation. And that's where you get more into the sense where now there's some sort of debt that's going on back and forth, and in order for God to have something to love. So just an interesting kind of implication of the conversation. But another quote that I'd like to read from you is sort of, this is just a very foundational thing, is saying that our existence is a function of love. But Joseph Pieper in his book, The Four Cardinal Virtues, spells out a little bit of what makes us unique, the kind of creation that we are. Because not all creation has rights. You know, a rock doesn't have rights in anywhere of the same senses which we talked about. Human beings have inalienable rights and things like that. So Pieper says here that in contrast to inanimate objects and things like that in creation, he says, man, however, is a person, a spiritual being, a whole unto himself, a being that exists for itself and of itself, that wills its own proper perfection. So the human being is like a little microcosm almost of the whole universe, is because we're capable of things like self-reflection. We're capable of willing our own perfection and so forth. Therefore, and for that very reason, something is due to man in the fullest sense. For that reason, he can, or he does inalienably have a right to which he can plead against everyone else, a right which imposes upon every one of his partners the obligation, at least, not to violate it. Indeed, man's personality, the constitution of his spiritual being, by virtue of which he is master of his own actions, even requires, says Thomas, that divine providence guide the personality for its own sake. So there's a sense in which God honors the fact that we're made in his image as the unique kind of creation that we are, is that divine providence guide us for our own sake, not just as tools for the puppeteering of God's will or something like that. And a few other little notes. The concept of personality is set forth in all of its elements, its freedom, its imperishability, and its responsibility for the whole of the world. If, on the contrary, man's personality is not acknowledged to be something wholly and entirely real, then right and justice cannot possibly be established. And that's why at the end of this little section on rights in the notes, I have this note about human nature, because it's characteristic of the existentialists and the atheistic existentialists in the 50s and moving forward, like Jean-Paul Sartre was a leading intellectual that really denied that there was anything, that human nature was a reality. He would say that human nature is simply a label that we put onto these things we find in front of us just as a matter of convenience. It's just like how would I describe it? When you call something a party, you know, we're having a party. The party isn't its own special kind of reality that invisibly binds all the people together. The party is just the name for all of us being in the same room for the same kind of reason, that we're celebrating a birthday or something like that. But from the Christian perspective, when I call, you know, Claudia, when I call you a person, I'm not just referring to a combination of parts. The fact that you have, you know, 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, and that you can talk and you look and act vaguely like other people. That's not what I'm saying. I'm referring to a distinct, singular kind of entity that is the cause for all those parts. So Sartre would kind of deny that there's a human nature at all. But part of the point here is that when you deny that there's a human nature, that a person means something and is a singular kind of being, then everything that goes along with it and as a consequence of it is then up for grabs. So you have this quote by Ivan Sokovich from the brothers Karamazov, who says very simply, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. And of course, again, that's a conclusion from a lengthy back and forth and conversation, things like that. He just sort of summarizes that up, is that if we don't have this foundation in an actual nature, and if that nature is not something real, something metaphysically real and grounded in reality, then it's a little bit just like we read here in Pieper, things are up for grabs, so to speak. So looking again at just some of these points about rights, we receive rights through creation, but creation itself is an act of love. It's not anyone's due. We also looked a little bit at how it has to do with the unique constitution as a person, and that if we don't have some kind of metaphysical ground for understanding the person as a distinct entity and not just the name for a bunch of atoms and molecules and chemicals and things like that happen to be in the same place at the same time, then we can't really safeguard justice at the level at which we would at least want to. Now, this ties into a conversation too about the other, which we also have as the next section in our notes, that justice is not only founded on rights and sort of the restoration of a debt on the basis of our rights, but justice is fundamentally oriented towards the other. So it is proper to justice as compared with the other virtues to direct man in his relation with others. So prudence, even though it ultimately manifests in the outward act, but prudence as such is very much internal. We talk about all these mental operations and about how you see reality and things like that and your intentions. But justice, by definition, is concerned with the external act. So there's several things that kind of follow from that. You see in the notes, just the Latin for that, justice is directed towards the other. And that's part of also why, just like what Aristotle said, the evening star nor the morning star is as glorious as justice. You have these other quotations saying that the luster of virtues appears above all in justice, because the luster of something is the gleam, the glimmer, the glint, and the shining out. Well, the shining out is visible in the external act. When you do something that is just in the world, that is virtue shining. Now, just to kind of illustrate, I'm not sure if I have this in the notes here. Yes, but just to kind of illustrate that, you see on the second page here, just by way of example, again, you can think of how much wine is acceptable to drink without violating the virtue of temperance. Now, temperance we'll talk about next week. I can't, no stranger can determine that for somebody else. You can definitely say that, you know, drinking, 2 gallons of wine is too much. But the point is where that subtlety is depends upon your constitution as a person and what the internal process is, if you're starting to feel impaired and so on and so forth. So maybe you can bracket out the extremes of it, but where that inner line is drawn as a function of your own inner self-awareness. But if you were asking a question, for instance, of how much do I owe the innkeeper, well, that can be objectively verified by anybody. In other words, I don't have to ask, well, what's Becky feeling? Or what's she thinking about how much she owes? I can just say, oh, you stayed a night, and a night's cost for sleeping here is this much. You owe this much. And to that extent, I don't care what you think about it or feel about it, because it doesn't alter that fact. What's just in that matter is a matter of externals. It's objective, and it's independently verifiable. And if you drink all the innkeeper's wine, then, yes, then I don't know how to help you. So there's this understanding that justice is concerned with the external act, but then the inverse of that also then holds, and that is that every external act belongs to the field of justice. And that's really a classical kind of observation that in some ways also is a little bit lost in our society, because in our society we want to carve out sort of these areas of our own individualism where we do things, but we want to make out as if maybe perhaps on the basis of an understanding of personal rights or something along those lines, that it's just affecting me. And there's a lot of spheres, a lot of domains of our outward acts where we defend them on the grounds that, well, it's really not influencing anybody else, or it's only impacting me. Whereas a classical understanding of justice doesn't mean that you have no right to privacy or anything like that, but would simply say there's a lot more that affects society and affects others about what you choose to do, even if you imagine it doesn't affect anybody, than the modern individual would say. And again, that's maybe a conversation that we can take up as we continue as well, and see kind of where we land on that. Now, interesting, Peter, that you mentioned the 10 Commandments, because I use the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments as an example here. That if you notice, all of the 10 Commandments are directed towards others. In other words, the 10 Commandments don't tell you to feel a certain way or think a certain thought. Maybe they imply, they say don't covet. So there's a little bit of that going on, but it's always at the very least directed towards the other, particularly towards the act. Don't steal what's not yours. Don't kill another person. Even when it's talking about the first commandments that are honoring God, these are in displays of worship or taking the Lord's name in vain or something like that. So the Ten Commandments are essentially exclusively dealing with those externals and firmly in the realm of justice. Now, let's see, I can hold it there for a second longer. A few other notes that I included in here just to help kind of bring some clarity is that being just means recognizing, so this is this outward, external, dealing with the other, dealing with other people. When we're talking about justice in particular, it's the other as other. So if you're thinking the other as my friend, or the other as someone who's useful to me, then we're really not talking about justice. It might not be a bad thing, if we're talking about affection or usefulness, those kind of relationships are out there. But at that point, we've kind of fallen short of justice, because as soon as we're considering someone as something of mine, either as in maybe a manipulative sense, like a possession, or just sort of along the lines of affection, we're perhaps talking about something else besides justice. So that's often a point of confusion, where we mistake certain acts as a just act that is really more of perhaps a loving act. And love is obviously one of the virtues that we'll end this series on. Also, it's important to note that in the Christian context, the human being is not beholden to an objective standard. We don't believe, like Plato did, in just these ideas, these ideal forms that are floating around and that make things what they are. We believe in a person, in a tri-personal God, a relational God. So for the Christian, the other and the outward are both indivisibly wedded into one. God is the great other. He's our creator. There's an infinite gap between the finite and the infinite, but he's also personal. So it's a beautiful element there that we're not beholden to an abstraction. We believe that the other is also the personal and is the relational. So just a few, again, very just preliminary thoughts about rights, the concern of justice with others, the external, the outward act. You can see that I like threes. We had threes in the last lesson as well. There's three fundamental types of justice that, again, according to this rubric and this kind of method of approach, which is not the only one, but this will kind of help us frame out, and again, think about how we act to other people and how, especially to form a well-rounded sense of being just in the world. Because it's, as I hope we'll see in a moment, it's easy to limit or negate certain of these domains entirely in preference for a certain view of justice, maybe a more limited one that we happen to prefer or want to make all that there is. So the first type of justice is commutative justice. You can think of this as contract justice. So this is deals with the relationship of individuals to individuals. So an example is one among a million is a contract to rent a moving truck. So I recently, I'm in the middle of a move. So you act as an individual, not as a representative of the state or anything else. You enter into an arrangement with another individual that is a contract. And that establishes, again, on this prior foundation of rights and of inherent dignity of all parties, you establish a debt. I'm lent this truck, I sign a contract, and now I'm obliged. I'm in a position of debt to pay the individual or the company for that truck. Now, the next type of justice is distributive. And this is just a label. So sometimes, I mean, when I first looked at this too, you can think of, maybe communism or socialism. It's not designed to imply that. It's just, again, just a term. But distributive justice refers the social whole to individuals. So an example of this would be the state, like the state of California, providing relief to victims of a fire in one of its counties. So we've certainly seen something like this. This is not individual or even a collection of individuals simply acting, but the state or the social whole as such, that is operating from that collective to individuals in some manner. The last is legal. So that is from individuals in reference to the social whole. So an example of this could be conscription of soldiers for war, or being jailed for drunk driving. So again, this is the responsibility that individuals as such have in relation to the social whole. So depending on our backgrounds, depending on who we are, depending upon what our experiences are, we may resonate with one or more of these, but the argument would be that all three of those do play a legitimate role, and maybe not an equal role in all societies, depending upon how they're structured. But what I think might help us is a little bit of a graphical representation or a diagram. And what I want to ask us to keep in mind is, as you see on the screen here, this individualism or collectivism. And again, depending, just like with A and B, we might have a bent towards one or the other in terms of what we would say is our philosophy, or just the policies that we would support, or how we think society should look. But before I get into some kind of scenarios and how they might impact this tripartite or triangular view of the three parts of justice, what might be thoughts about the limitations of this graph, or are there, it's not this visual, are there any limitations? Does it fail to capture something? Does it oversimplify something? Just to summarize again, commutative justice is contract justice, so relations between people. We form agreements all the time. I sign a contract to work a job for a wage. I could rent the truck. I sign a mortgage, whatever, all those things. It's between individuals or smaller or groups of people. Legal justice, again, is the individual's relation to the social whole. So, you're beholden to follow the laws, not to drive drunk and things like that. You're responsible. And then again, distributive justice is the responsibility or the obligations of the social whole to individuals. And again, one example of that is in some kind of compensation for natural disasters, and many other examples. So maybe initial thoughts about the visual representation, its strengths, its limitations. There's one big limitation that I would be willing to admit to this, but I want to hear what any of you might think first.
Well, it looks to me like you have to have some of everything to have equal parts, to have it work.
Okay, explain.
Balance, foundational, whatever you want to call it, but some of this, and some of this, so that you have it like kind of a whole justice system.
So you're saying you have to have a whole community in order for this to be
You have
relevant?
some of everything to have it function.
Okay, yeah. So you would decide on the side that they are all necessary, and if you take one out, then you are really missing something that's integral to any healthy society.
Yeah.
Mom.
What isn't collectivism like a social network of socialism versus individually exceptional or not?
Well, that's why I just put the terms there. Right? That's why I just put the terms there, because we all will naturally read into it something of what we want to. And so, yes, that is one form, I would 100%, that collectivism can take, is these sort of collectivist systems, which obviously we've seen that in the 20th century, and communism has in many ways demonstrated itself to be a failed system, or one that has at least produced a lot of death. And that might be, but someone might say that's a perverted form of collectivism, that not all forms of collective entities or anything like that are all evil. And perhaps someone might look at individualism with sort of an askance eye and say, well, that's part of our big problem in our society, is we all think we're too, we're hyper individualistic. And that might be part of the problem. But we'll touch on that and how that might affect this image in just a moment. But any thoughts, other thoughts just on the representation? So one limitation that I would say from the outset of this, and that could be misleading, is it seems visually to categorize the social whole as a wholly distinct and separate, because it's physically a separate part on the image, from individuals. But the point is that individuals are part of what make up the social whole. So it's not as if you have this thing called the social whole, community or society, civil society, and then you have individuals that are just relating to it. The social whole is comprised of individuals. So it's hard to kind of represent that A and B and all the others are, in addition to being distinct and discrete entities within that group, also part of what constitutes that group as well. So that's why I would caution anyone to be misled by the image of thinking that individuals are somehow separate and outside of the social whole, because that's not, I'd say that's philosophically not tenable, but it's also practically not how anybody lives. I think all of us grew up in, whether we grew up in a home that was imperfect, or even for someone who was adopted, let's say, you're still nested within society. From the very outset, before you even know you're around, you are part of a communal process that fundamentally impacts you, and you cannot actually grow to be anywhere near to the point of self-sufficiency outside of that. Peter.
I would love, out of respect for your brain, I would love for you to comment candidly on what I'm going to say next.
Yes.
Between individualism or collectivism,
Mhm.
I am a huge champion of individual rights. And for the most part, the collective, society, and government can go to hell. The majority, the majority, government and society are frequently wrong,
Mhm.
mean, vicious, misguided, uninformed, misinformed. And people who take the opposite position,
Mhm.
they love to argue the individual should compromise, give up another right,
Mhm.
bend, be flexible for the good of the common welfare. And they say basically, you have no rights, or they need to be suspended. The need to be suspended historically is the plea of tyrants. That's what every historical big name dictator argued. That's what Hitler argued about the Jews. We need to eliminate the Jews, etc. Well, if you go down that road, it ends up with genocide, which is horrible,
Yeah, and
indefensible.
we've seen that throughout the 20th century.
And to me, it is logically impossible for a collective to have any right when no member of the collective has any individual rights,
Mhm.
because some authoritarian in the collective ordains that.
Mhm.
If no member of the collective has a right, the collective has no rights. Now today, in Pastor Jim's sermon, I paid very close attention to what he said.
Mhm. And I'm listening to you, by the way, I'm just looking at a quote that's relevant to what you're saying.
And he quoted parts of the Bible, which to me are inherently inconsistent, but they illustrate this problem. One part of the gospel says, the individual shall yield his rights per all the authorities, all the civil authorities above the individual. Well, that assumes the authority never usurps power, never exceeds their authority. And in the USA, we have something called the Bill of Rights and Due Process of Law.
Right, the rule of law.
And government does usurp its authority, and that's dangerous. And then in Jim's lecture, or sermon rather, he quoted another part of the Bible which said, enjoy your freedoms, Live as if you're a free person. Well,
Hmm.
when the government usurps its power and says, you're the bad, evil one because you won't yield to the collective,
Mhm.
but they're violating your rights, government's power ends. Their legitimate authority ends at citizens' rights. And that's per even government itself. But government frequently violates its own rules.
Mhm. Yes, and so there's numerous things you said up here, and I appreciate you articulating the point with forcefulness, because it is particularly relevant, not just as a historical point, but as a contemporary point. To reiterate, the collectivist systems, which are properly labeled that, the communist systems of the 20th century, unleashed untold bloodshed. I mean, killed more people than had been killed in all the wars in all of history up to that point. Now, and I would also agree, and I think it's a very salient point, that the rights of the state, or let's just say the just execution of certain obligations of the state, are the bedrock of those, and the foundation of those is the individual rights, individual particular rights. If you try and build a system that's not on that, and actually it's good because you're touching on many quotes from this book that I didn't put into the presentation, but if you try and build a system on anything that isn't that, you end up with something of a kind of distorted kind of collectivism. And I think, let's see. Okay, good. Here's a quote here. So let's one quote, for example, sort of on the dangers of collectivism. With this, it becomes possible to formulate one more essential element of totalitarian government. The person endowed with political power claims to give a comprehensive definition of the tangible content of the good of society. The fact that a 5-year plan tries to achieve a higher rate of industrial production or seeks a closer adjustment between supply and demand is not in itself a fatally destructive feature. What is fatally destructive is the elevation of such a plan to the exclusive standard to which not only the production of goods is subordinated, but also the work at the universities, the creative activity of the artist, and the use of even leisure. Thus, everything that cannot be justified by this standard must, for that simple reason, suffer suppression as socially unimportant and undesirable. So that is one of the hallmarks of the totalitarian system, certainly, is that it fundamentally subordinates any sense of individual supremacy, the inviolability of human rights, to a collective sort of vision of things. What I would say to moderate what you're saying is I might try and push things to an extreme to say that, all that being said, human beings are social animals. In other words, just as a fact of nature, we don't, like some animals do, some mammals do, live very solitary lives. They are basically, certain animals from a few hours after they're born are able almost to survive by themselves. We aren't that way, and after a year on this earth, we're capable of kind of wiggling around and making plaintive noises, like we can't. So we do require a family or a structure that ties us to other people just to be able to exist. You couldn't have got here, I couldn't have got here, nobody could have got here unless in some sense we were cared for, taught language, provided sustenance and everything like that for years and years before we could be of any utility to anybody. So that's would be an argument to say that even for societies that don't want to acknowledge it, love has to be the basis for human interaction. And so what I would say is not as much of a disagreement, but maybe a clarification to your point, is that it is important, I believe, and I think the tradition acknowledges this, to acknowledge the fact that we are social creatures, that we literally cannot survive on our own. We couldn't even get to this point on our own. We require others for learning, for growth, for everything. So there is some sense in which we are indebted to each other in a way that just doesn't quite allow me just to say, I'm me, I'm completely cordoned off from everybody else. I owe you nothing unless I agree to do it. So, if you try and make me do that, then good luck. I do believe there's a right sense of balance, and that balance has to be struck on the basis of the uniqueness and the sanctity of each individual. And that's a Christian theme, that every individual being made in the image of God, but also some sense in which it isn't my right it would be an abuse of my right and my claim on liberty and independence to just tell everyone that I don't owe you anything. And I'm not beholden to my country, I'm not beholden to my family. I think we're seeing that play itself out in a lot of I think that would qualify as a hyper individualism if you just went completely down that road. I'm not saying that you are, but it's a conversation we can have to find out where that line is. But if you went so far down that road that you do that, I think you're just living a contradiction. You're denying the very fact that allowed you to get here today and to receive your education and to survive past the many, many, many years of being a baby and toddler, where if society or your family didn't do anything for you, you wouldn't even exist. So I think they're very salient points, and I think in dealing with this individualism or collectivism, maybe that'll cash out a little bit more too of what you're saying, because I would say that I, by my nature, like to classify myself as a kind of healthy individualism. I was raised on old Westerns and the cowboys, and there was this rugged sense of these heroes who were very self-sufficient, and the men of the West, and but they had a sense of honor and a sense of duty to help others too. So there's a kind of that rugged individualism or the sense of American exceptionalism or something. I think that that's somehow our heritage, not just in the United States, but in the West as well. But I would say, let's take the extremes of both an individualism and a collectivism. If we take an extreme version of individualism, how might this image change? In terms of how we represent the three types of justice we discussed? If we're saying it's extreme individualism, I mean, this is has its predecessors in John Locke, in Thomas Hobbes, those kind of figures, where the individual is really all that there is. How does this change? How might this change? What types of justice might be curtailed or even disappear entirely?
Distributed, yeah.
And why?
Because if you're only concerned about what you can get, you're not going to even consider the other, so or what their need might. So it would be tweaked. Okay, and I think that's true. In fact, I would think that the point might even be more foundational than that, and I'll explain why in a moment if anyone else has another comment on the different types of justice and how they might be impacted.
Legal might be impacted.
Why?
Because if we aren't a group, we don't need laws. We need laws because.
Okay, so I think you're hitting on two sides of the same coin. So I would say that it is true that both legal and distributive justice essentially are either highly curtailed or disappear. And again, this is taking sort of a hyperbolic and extreme version of both of these categories. And the reason why is towards what both of you are saying, but even on a more fundamental level, is the social whole itself isn't regarded as a distinct type of thing within society. Now again, social whole is only ever comprised of people. There's no such thing as a social whole separate from people, but that it is a certain order of reality that is part of what establishes us as who we are. But if you are a hyper individualist, you say there are only really individuals, it tends to reduce everything to commutative justice, to contract justice. And that's where these precedents have a very noble place in our American heritage. We have the phrase social contract. We use that a lot, and that's often used to talk about how our nation was framed as a type of social contract. I think there's more subtlety to it than just saying that. But if you take that extreme view, then what you really have is just contract justice. So you just have individuals or even groups of individuals, but again, they're still just the individuals in the same place at the same time, maybe with the same intention. But the whole social whole is a different kind of order that of which we're participating in is really not acknowledged, at least at a formal legal level. So you have people making contracts, and you have individuals making a contract to have the very government that we have today. Now, so in that case, even the social whole really disappears because you just have a series of different individuals. Now, if we restore the image and ask ourselves the question of collectivism, an extreme version of collectivism, what might be curtailed there?
I think, well, I think the commutative and the legal would be pretty much done away.
Okay, it's commutative and the legal. Why the
Well, the commutative is, which is contract based somewhat, that ability to contract with somebody and barter, wheel and deal, whatever you want to call it, would be gone, because if you wouldn't have that right to be able to go outside the realm of the whole.
Right. So, and you, or maybe not even being acknowledged that you have an existence as a private entity.
Right.
Yeah. And well, what about distributive? Because again, distributive signifies the social whole to individuals, the obligation.
I think maybe it would, it's there, you're going more towards a more socialistic or communistic, where you're given because that's what the head of the justice, distributive justice says, this is what you get, and this is what you get, and this is what you get. And so if you have, it might be everybody gets the same, or it might not be, because not all communists, you look at North Korea, Kim Jong-un is extremely.
Well, they often don't deliver what they promise anyway, but yeah, but in theory, what they're saying they'll get.
But there's always abuse, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you don't have, because everybody's given, whether you need it or not, whether you want it or not, everybody's pretty much given, this is what you get.
Right, kind of by fiat. That's the old Marxist adage was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And again, didn't really work out that way in any case. But really quickly, Mom, and any other addition to that?
No, I was saying legal because there was for China no rights. And you are not special. You were just and the bourgeoisie, the elite, or a few, but that's godless.
It's kind of an oligarchy that oversees
It's an
everything.
oligarchy where you were, Jesus created us so individually exceptional to have peace and wealth and future. So it's getting off on a tangent.
No, sure, no, it's a good point. So there's a strong argument that perhaps all three of these are in some way heavily impaired. I would say, firstly, easy to say commutative justice goes away because individuals, insofar as you can even refer to them as individuals anymore, don't have this sort of sense of right of privately making contracts and dealings with each other because they're not acknowledged as a viable entity in that society. Everything is seen from the perspective of the social whole. So that's why also very strongly, at least this is how I would, the conclusion that I would come to from this framing is that distributive justice is impaired because the state doesn't owe you anything. Because, and it's at a more fundamental level because in an ideological sense, there almost is no you. There almost is no you. So perhaps in maybe some limited sense, legal justice still exists because the parts of the whole are completely beholden to the whole and are their sole function is to support whatever the whole wills. Just like, you know, I want my hand to grab something, you know, and so the part is only doing it by virtue of what the whole wants it to do. You're like the hand. Here's a little quote on the collectivist, sort of to kind of maybe drive the nail into that coffin. The collectivist interpretation is more immediately timely. It predicates that there is no such thing as an individual capable of entering into relationships in his own right. Above all, no private relations between individuals exist. Man's life has a totally public character towards what you're saying, Peter. It's a complete erasure of private property, but also the individual as anything that is sacred or defendable. Defined only through his membership in the social whole, which is the only reality. Of course, no social theory can alter the fact that individuals are actually in relation with each other. Even in the most totalitarian state, I address actual men and hence individuals whenever I speak. However, all such relations can at any moment be interpreted as official. Think 1984, classic. If they have not been official in the first place, suddenly I find myself no longer associating with my friend, my wife, my father, but with a co-functionary in the state cause, that is, with a state functionary. As a result, all human relationships are simultaneously subordinated to the yardstick of fulfilling a function and may abruptly cease to exist when I do not conform to the stipulated norm. Appalling examples of this type are part and parcel of contemporary experience. So again, the point of this exercise is not to tell any of you what to think or say, it would be too easy, let's say, just to say, this is what Luke says is right and believe this. This is more about providing a framework and a set of concepts and a way of bracketing this out that allows us to appreciate the strengths, but also perhaps the limitations of certain perspectives. So since we're running short on time, we'll kind of at a decent pace move through this final section, and anyone who wants to hang around at the end for questions, we can touch on that. The limits of justice, 3 exceptions. So justice is not all that there is, and sometimes those of us with a very strong sense of justice want to make it all that there is, and just like the old saying goes, too much of a good thing. So where does justice end, and where is it kind of have to cede territory to the domain of something else? Well, let's recall our earlier quote. We said creation itself is not an act of justice. Creation is not anyone's due, right? Because you get your rights by being created. So God's creation is an act of love, not of justice. But that means the converse of this, which we didn't spell out earlier, but which I'm going to do now, is that whatever man renders to God is due to God. Yet it cannot be equal as though man rendered to God as much as he owes him. In other words, God didn't owe it to us to create us. That was just an act of love. But conversely, we received everything we have from God, not only our own life, but this whole universe as well. So we owe him everything. There's an infinite debt to the infinite one. And so that might seem at first like, oh, frightening. That's kind of scary because now I'm between a rock and a hard place. God brought me into an existence only to say that I can never pay the debt back for being here. But if we spell this out from maybe a more positive perspective and through the lens of faith, there's some really beautiful kind of implications. But one of the implications, of course, is that our relationship to God is not, again, a tit for tat thing. It's not predicated on this basis that, yeah, I can pay God back. And then, hey, maybe if I'm really good at paying him back, maybe he'll owe me a few things. That would be through a common intuition a mistake. But why would it be a mistake? Well, to spell that out, we'll say a few words about these 3 exceptions, 3 limits to where justice doesn't fully capture a part of our human interaction, but it's nevertheless integral to a fully flourishing life. So we can't ever pay God back, right? Well, how then do we just not do anything towards God? Do we just say, well, can't pay him back, so might as well not try? Well, not quite. I'll just go ahead and read this just because, again, for the sake of time. In response to this realization, authentic religion, it's the first kind of domain where there's let's say, transcendence of justice, or an exceeding of justice, of what justice can strictly demand, because justice kind of falls apart when you're talking about you can't pay God back, so what do we do? Has always emphasized the centrality of sacrifice. As Christians in particular, we hold the sacrifice of Jesus Christ as the supreme act of human history. As created beings, we recognize that there is an infinite gap of indebtedness between us and the Creator. There is a spirit then of excess that goes along with the great traditions of the church, such as the fasting of Lent and the showering of each other with gifts at Christmas. These gestures, far from being an attempt to earn our salvation through works, which is what the accusation very often is, why are you doing fasting? Why are you doing this? You're trying to earn your salvation, you're trying to work. No, far from it. Rather, on the contrary, they reflect an acceptance of the fact that we can never do enough for God. And so our worship of him should take the form of an excess. In other words, we're not going to pretend. I'm not going to pretend that I've checked the right boxes and done enough. So my gestures to God are just going to be as over the top and overflow as much as I can make out to be. And those are often joyous overflows. The fasting is a wonderful exercise. Anyone who participates in that in the proper spirit, the results are almost unanimously deeper and richer appreciation of the good of life. And so often with things like Christmas. So here's an example of someone who's maybe too caught up in thinking that justice is operative between ourselves and God, and maybe I can pay God back and do all that I need to do. This is the Pharisee. Jesus gives the example of the Pharisee that is next to the other gentleman who's really reproaching himself at the temple. The Pharisee comes up and says, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people, like this guy over here. That robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector here. Yeah, this guy. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all that I get. He's rightly pointed out as a problem figure, and rather Jesus recommends a different, not slightly a different point of view. Jesus says, so also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Now, obviously, you have to understand this all within context. Jesus isn't saying, you're worthless, you have no dignity. Of course not. The incarnation, the sacrifice of Jesus, the love that he showed to us while we were abusing him is an example par excellence to the contrary. The point here is to say, don't ever think that you've repaid God back, that you're equal with God, because the moment you do that, you've engaged in the deepest kind of hubris you could possibly do. And talk about totalitarian states. The emperors of Rome, Nero and those guys, they were the ones who thought that they were God or gods. The totalitarian leaders had some sort of God complex about them. So this proper humility that befits religion and the spirit of sacrifice that comes from acknowledging that we can never pay that debt back is actually a strong buffer and damper on the totalitarian tendencies that unfortunately is part of the human condition. Just a brief note too on piety and respect. Filial piety, as you see on the little paragraph there, is basically just a contraction of that religious sacrifice that we have in our relationship with God. We owe something unique to our parents in a much more limited way, but in an analogous way, because our parents gave us a gift through the grace of God and through the existence of the created world that we also can't repay. And because they're the most direct cause of our life. They gave us our life. And in classic societies, that's why they're pretty universally was this deep sense of filial piety was integral to the sense of human flourishing. You can never really fully repay the ones who gave you your existence. Now, that doesn't mean that your parents could be terrible people and can rightly be, that's why it's different than talking about God, because they can do all sorts of things that are worthy of reproach. And the point isn't to be slaves to abusive parents or anything like that. But the point is to seek to honor them despite their imperfections for giving you something that you can never fully repay again, which is your life. Lastly, the Latin is observantia or observantia. That is like when we say we observe a holiday. It's the best translated word is respect. Respect in particular for those persons who are distinguished by their office or some dignity. This again is something which doesn't jive very strongly with our modern sensibilities. The kings of old were plenty of examples of really horrible kings, just like horrible dictators. So it's in our modern mindset. If you look at modern movies and they depict the church or some priest or bishop, it's like 90% of the time it's some horribly corrupt, lecherous, or it's always, or like the kings. There's some elements, where that's preserved in Lord of the Rings and things like that. There's a sense of the noble king, but our modern mindset is leery of that, and that's part of our nation's history, and because there have been bad kings. But this, I would say that we do ourselves a disservice when we lose and deprive ourselves of the ability to respect an office, even while justly reproaching the individual who holds that office. Without inviting conversation on the topic, not just in the interest of time. I know plenty of people who will say of someone like Donald Trump that he was is a brazen, narcissistic, just brash, gross guy, and had nothing that they could possibly say anywhere near towards respect while he held office. I also know people who will say of Joseph Biden that he is a senile, corrupt, doddering old man and cannot muster any kind of respectful comment even towards the office. I would say a healthy, from the reflections on the tradition, a healthy response to maybe that dichotomy would say, reserve the ability to critique the man while also retaining respect for the office. Because what happens is if you blend the two together, it's like the Christian doctrine, love this sinner, hate the sin. If we lump the sinner and the sin together, then we're going to lose a lot of people, and we're going to end up hurting a lot of people in the process. Same thing here. If you lump the office and the individual holding the office together, you will start to lose respect for the office itself. And I think we're dangerously close to doing that. We have suspicion of all of our politicians, not without just cause, but if you don't believe that there's anything in your political system that's worth retaining, if you just get to the point where it's all corrupt, all the presidents and the senators, if the whole thing, there can come a time when that's necessary to conclude. But if you come to that place anywhere but from the fact of absolute necessity, then I think you are engaging in a form of despair, and you're giving up on the good in society. It's like fighting for your family. Maybe your family is messed up and has a lot of problems. Maybe there's a lot of addiction or whatever. But if you use that as a pretense to just write off your family, you might have a reason for it, but you will lose maybe something that could have been saved in the process. So retaining some respect for the office, and again, that's tied into that sense of our country, our civilization has afforded us benefits that we ourselves cannot claim responsibility for. I didn't invent the phone, I didn't invent the car, I didn't discover electric lights or computers or anything like that, and yet I am an heir to all of those things, and my life is bettered by access to those benefits of civilization. I owe some respect to the country and to the offices, if not the individuals always, for that. Really quick, and then we're going to wrap up.
Parallel, because God has loved me, ABC, I am to love the person in the office and pray for them.
Well, yeah, love, like,
When
right,
you're not
love.
secure within your own framework and you're all over the map, you're going to act, I hate this and I hate that. But when you know, for me, when I know that Jesus died for me, loves me, I owe that to my personal life, to my peers around me, to love the office and pray for who's ever in there, because God is on the throne. And it's an extension of his love down.
Right. And it would be love, but and it would also be something in addition to love. That there is a sense that's related to justice of saying, my country, as screwed up and as bad as it might be, worthy of just reproach, civilization has afforded me certain benefits that I myself cannot claim responsibility for, and the proper attitude and disposition in response to that is a form of respect. And again, it's not slavishness, it's not naive, like, oh, the Führer can't do anything wrong. It's none of that. It's making that distinction, just like the Christian says, love the sinner, hate the sin. It's the same kind of thing in the political dimension. So to wrap up, when we're talking about, pardon me here, just going beyond justice again. Things that are not compelled by the demands of justice, we've been hinting at them in different ways, but are nevertheless necessary for a humane community, are things like affability, kindness, friendliness. Many other examples abound. Society cannot survive without justice, but there is, let me see here, a lovely little quote here. Now as man could not live in society without truth, so likewise not without joy. But joy and these related sort of attributes aren't things that can be commanded by justice. In the name of justice, I can say, Amber, pay me back the $100 you borrowed from me, and maybe with some interest now because you've been delinquent. But I can't say, and do it with a smile in the name of justice. Or I can say, and be grateful, to me for, whatever. There are certain things you cannot command in the name of justice, but which are nevertheless necessary for a good human society. So when we're thinking about this, justice covers so much, and it covers so much of the external acts and our relationship to each other, but it's not exhaustive. And we'll have a lot more to say about that when we talk about the virtue of love. But just to make that recognition that justice can demand quite a few things, but it cannot demand and secure in its name everything that's necessary for our human flourishing. So our final quote will be, to be willing to watch over peace and harmony among men through the commandments of justice is not enough when charity, love, has not taken firm root among them. So that sort of just summarizes that understanding that justice is a tremendous concept. It's one that has been delved into throughout the ages, and there's quite a bit to say about, especially from the Christian perspective, and the understanding of human dignity, made in the image of God, being a rational being, responsible for ourselves and for others. But our calling is not to just end or stop at justice. Ultimately, it's to be taken into the life of God himself, who is love. So with that being said, I know we went a little bit over time, but we had some good back and forth, and I'm happy for a few minutes in the end here to, if we have any questions. But next week, we are going to talk about, made a slight change to the schedule, and I'm going to be combining fortitude and temperance because they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. And I call them guardians of the good, and we'll see why they are called guardians of the good. So we'll tackle the final two cardinal virtues, fortitude and temperance, next week. And then that means we'll be setting the stage for the theological virtues, which are the distinctly Christian virtues, or those accessible to those who live a life of faith. So with that wraps up the lesson. But if anyone has any questions or final remarks or things like that, and yeah, Peter. Thank you. Thank you. My deep hope is that this stimulates conversation, and Peter, I want to say that I deeply respect but also enjoy the fervor with which you speak, and the conviction. And I think kind of apathy is a challenging problem in our society, and sometimes in conversations with people, I struggle to find something that they care about enough to even voice an opinion on it, let alone actually take a stand for or die for or something like that. And it's evident that you've thought these things through, and that your conviction is compelling, and it's inspiring to me. So I want to thank you too, Peter, for that. Yes.
Very briefly, along those lines, about 2 months ago, the Sebastopol City Council was talking about the things they thought were fair and just.
You were at this meeting?
And they made a statement where they took it upon themselves to speak for all 8,000 living in Sebastopol. And they made it really clear that, hey, you're either with us or you're not. And they said, we need, as a community, to speak with just one voice. And it had to be their voice.
Mm-hmm.
That pushed me to when I wrote them back,
them's fighting words. Yeah.
I wrote them back and I said, what in the world happened to independent thought, freedom of speech?
Oh, yeah.
The First Amendment is still on the books, and there were serious flaws to this one voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you're not dictators yet.
Right.
And that's just the arrogance of the self-appointed, the self-anointed.
Yeah. Also, there's a book by Thomas Sowell, The Vision of the Anointed,
Yes.
which is a really, I enjoy Thomas Sowell's work, and yeah, I think towards what you're saying, the fact that, and it's like the A and B kind of thing. That's why I said is that how can A and B talk again? Can they? Because we're in a pluralistic society, and we've so lost any kind of common set of convictions that do we even share the same root principles, or are we so speaking so different languages that we can't even talk anymore? It's anyone who takes the cheap road of saying that, well, if you don't agree with me, then you must be either a fool or a bigot or some combination of the two.
Or a racist.
Or yeah, right. Anything that falls underneath that banner is that it's a cheap substitute for actual civil discourse and dialogue, because you're just trying to negate the person from the outset. And so yeah, that's part of that is resisting the urge to do that on our own side, and also trying to represent ourselves in a way that appeals to something of what we have to hope is still some kind of common ground there, that to demonstrate that that's not, the label doesn't fit. I've had conversations, for instance, with people who because I usually to do with my faith or something like that, that initially, and oftentimes through social media where it's easier to do this, people will say all sorts of horrendous things, and they'll just say, you're, every name in the book. And I've actually had the ability to meet some of those people in real life because of mutual associations. And on more than one occasion, the response has been, you're actually a really interesting guy to talk to, or this, it was like the illusion was being dispelled, or the spell was being kind of somewhat broken. Like, oh wait, maybe half of the country aren't aren't like crypto Nazis, or maybe half the country isn't. Pick your favorite thing, because both sides do it to an extent. So yeah, I think it's an exercise in patience and endurance in the conviction of the truth. It's not an easy thing, and just without getting onto a different track, but I know you mentioned Jim's sermon earlier. I would say that the exercising the right to not take full advantage of your rights can be a virtue if given the proper motivation and the proper context. So in other words, I have a right to, okay, a soldier does this in war. You have a right to your life, right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's right there. But voluntarily saying, I'm going to potentially forgo my accessibility to that right, or put myself where that right is, I no longer have a claim over my whole life in that way. The general might lead me into a battle where I'm going to get killed. I might be part of the D-Day, the Normandy landings. That isn't because the soldier's a weakling. It isn't because they're a pushover. It's because they have assessed themselves and they've said, rights are important, but there are things, higher realities for which standing on my rights is not always the right thing to do, or it's not the highest thing to do, perhaps. So, and it just, again, not as more of as a food for thought kind of thing than anything else, but yeah. Amber. Oh, and then other, yeah, I said again.
So, biblically speaking, we should exercise prudence and temperance in our execution and our ideal of justice. Is that what your position is?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, prudence is implied, yeah, by justice. So justice takes like all of the last lesson wholly for granted. A justice that isn't based upon a sober-minded apprehension of reality and a subservience to the truth is no justice at all. It descends into cunning and tactfulness and manipulation. And again, that's like not straight up 1984 style. You see the state apparatus is like totally controlling everybody, and news speak, and there's it's and law courts are completely subverted, and or animal farm, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. It's that all has its basis in a warping and a deception and a clouding of reality. So yeah, it has to be tempered by, infused by prudence and tempered by temperance, modified by temperance, but specifically from the Christian point of view, love pervades our lives in a way that, again, means that justice is not the exhaustive reality. And I think that could have been the weakness and the downfall of the classical civilizations like Rome. Rome, this tremendous empire with so many achievements and accomplishments, but love was not among its highest virtues. You know, justice would have ranked highly up there, and perhaps by not allowing for that understanding, the proper understanding of who we are under God, and the fact that all of creation is a function of love, allowed them to, you know, that's why they still had slaves, and they still, you know, there were certain things that they just wouldn't necessarily come to unless justice was touched upon and enlivened by love. And so that's why I say love to the end, because the idea is that the theological virtues are called the infused virtues. And it's this idea that God infuses them into our lives, and they don't negate all the other virtues that came before it, but they're grafted in, and they cause a new glimmer, a new shining to come out from those virtues too. Is that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, maybe in contemporary society, you know, if you weigh one virtue out among the other, it seems, you know, we spent so much of the lesson today talking about how our view of justice is really colored by the collectivism or the individualism, and maybe justice today is higher up on the list than love, and maybe that's how we've got so skewed.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be had there. And again, what we're doing in these lessons is abstracting particular virtues one by one from real concrete scenarios where they never just exist on themselves. Prudence never just exists by itself. Justice never exists by itself. So these are all, it's just like taking a flower and dissecting it. You know, in reality, you don't just find petals and leaves, you know, you find the flower. And that's the living reality. When you dissect it, you kind of, you know, you're no longer dealing with the living flower. So, you know, all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt, or better yet, kind of the extremes that it might seem like the things might lead to if you're just looking at one virtue at a time, have to kind of be held in abeyance as we begin to kind of come to this full-fledged understanding of things. And so, yeah, no, justice is not all that there is to say by any stretch of the imagination, but a justice that's in the Christian sense tempered by love, then you're talking about something that is closer to God and different than just what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, if that helps, yeah. Peter, I had a...
Yeah, do you have an email address that you share publicly?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll spell it out because it's leukocyte64. So it's LEUKOCYTE64@gmail.com. That's my uncle used to call me that. It's the name for a white blood cell, but it sounds like Luke. So
okay,
yeah.
LEUKOCYTE
64@gmail.com. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and Peter, and then Claudia, and then we'll respective.
Regarding rights, a few years ago, I was talking to an older Las Vegas, Nevada policeman. And I said, what was it like being a policeman in Las Vegas? And he said he was real close to retirement. He had been a cop in other jurisdictions. And he said in Las Vegas, it's really hard being a cop. And I said, why? And he said, this place is a dense pack of hard rights. And I never heard the term hard rights. And I said, what do you mean by hard rights? He says, here, a very high disproportionate number of people, they only think in terms of their rights. They're unwilling to recognize the existence of other people's rights. And he says, it's like bumper cars. He says, people with their hard right mentality just smash into other people. And I'm going to give you, you know, I've been complimentary of you, but one of the, probably the most important thing I learned from this is your idea of there is a virtue in voluntarily exercising your right not to exercise or not to press to the fullest limit your right. And to your credit, I think you're right. There's a lot of merit to that. But I think there's also a danger to that.
Point taken,
Because
yeah.
the wolves among us can misinterpret that as weakness, and they'll press too far. And when they do that, when they come across certain people who aren't laid back and passive, there's going to be a collision.
Sure, and again, it's not an advocacy to be naive or taking advantage of it. That goes back to prudence. You know, be innocent in doves, but shrewd and as vipers, or as shrewd as serpents. So that's a paradoxical balance to strike. But yeah, you know, Christian life is not a call to be a pushover. Christian life is a call to strength, and it's knowing when and for the sake of what to plant your flag and say, I'm dying on this hill, and when to say, that's pettiness or that's self-serving, you know, trying to insist on something that is for a lesser cause or something. Claudia.
I was thinking between justice and tyranny, but in a society it gets kind of messed up and mixed up and is flopping around and trying to find its way. That if we use a pure justice, a blind justice, whichever this kind is, but we'll right the ship between justice and tyranny, one man, one idea, one, you know, this is where we have to. If we will keep our justice, you know, and not throw that out the door or out the window and ignore justice, it'll keep us away from tyranny, you know, hard tyranny.
Absolutely. You know, justice is, like we said at the outset, is not to be a respecter of persons. And yet it has to weigh the actual circumstances of the moment. You have to really look at the case in front of you and say, what did the person do? What did they not do? If we're looking at a legal court example. And so knowing how to split that and make that distinction where you're not allowing the consideration to be tainted by that preference to a person while still weighing the objective circumstances, because justice is never abstract in the sense that it's always addressed to this particular circumstance. At 5:35 p.m., so-and-so struck so-and-so with a car on this corner. What would it, you know, that's particular. But to preserve justice in its purity so that it doesn't look like justice is then just saying, well, we're going to give preferential treatment to this person because they know the city official, that kind of thing. Then people think that justice is just a glorified form of tribalism, and that truth dissolves ultimately into power. And that's what the postmoderns would say, people like Michel Foucault, and that truth is really just a power narrative. And if we're there, then we really stop believing in justice. And yeah, anyone will say, oh yeah, this court verdict or whatever, you know, that's just because they're protecting the status quo and the institutionalized biases, you know, and then if that's where we're at, or if that's where people think we're at, then, you know, we can no longer appeal to a justice that people believe in, then yeah, we're in a tough way. But well, I want to thank everyone because we've definitely invested more time, and I want to honor everybody's time. But hopefully we had some interesting, I think we had an interesting discussion. We came to some interesting observations, and next week is going to be temperance and fortitude. So courage, temperance, and then we'll be able to get into the theological virtues. So
2 o'clock again.
2 o'clock, 2 to 3, and 3-ish. We'll try and keep it as close to that as possible. So thank you all. It's been a treat for me.
Thank you.